The Russians and Chinese had stayed clear. The forecast was good. Assuming victory, the UN command changed its strategy. As part of 10th Corps, the 1st Marine Division was sent climbing into the Sawtooth Tibet Mountains on a headlong race for the Yalu River, the far northern border of North Korea. The 1st Marine Division was about to face an entirely different war. Private First Class Win Scott.
Everything froze. Our carbines wouldn't work, artillery rounds fell short, sometimes into our own positions. Morphine froze hard as stone. The corpsmen carried the syrettes in their mouths to keep them thawed out enough to help numb the wounded.
Second Lieutenant Patrick Rowe.
Around noon that day, an excited civilian appeared with the news that Chinese Army Patrol had entered his settlement and ordered all the civilians to evacuate their houses because 10,000 Chinese troops needed shelter.
In one of the greatest troop movements in history, 150,000 communist Chinese regulars had marched through Manchuria undetected and surrounded the 1st Marine Division at the Chosin Reservoir, which is known to Koreans as Chongjin. Private First Class Robert Cameron was there.
I heard this racket down the slope. It was like the sound of a Chinese birthday party, weddings, and the funeral all rolled into one. People chanting, blowing horns, ringing bells, clashing cymbals, beating drums.
At 2:30 in the morning, during a blinding snow squall, with the temperature jamming rifles and freezing hands at 20 below zero, the Chinese struck.
When the illumination rounds popped overhead, I saw a whole lot of people headed our way. I'm telling you, there were 1,000 individuals down there in massed infantry formation.
When dawn finally came, and the fury of Marine fighter planes arrived to drive off the surviving Chinese, the Marines on the ground had suffered enormous casualties, but their positions held. For 3 days and nights, things only got worse. The demonic cold and ferocious Chinese attacks exacted terrible tolls. The threat of annihilation hung over the chosen Marines. These were hardships that few Americans had ever endured. Task Force Faith, the Army forces on the east side of the reservoir, were cut off and nearly annihilated. Those who escaped did so across the ice. The ferocity of Task Force Drysdale's journey through Hellfire Valley, where a combined force of U.S. Marines, Army, and British Royal Marines was savagely battered by Chinese forces holding the surrounding high ground. And the epic stand and rescue at Tak Kong Pass, where the 250 Marines of Fox Company held a crucial high mountain pass for 5 days against an enemy regiment. Relief finally came from a battalion of Marines led by Lieutenant Colonel Raymond G. Davis, who fought their way through blizzard conditions in the dark and wind chills of 50 below zero to bushwhack across the wild mountain ridges and reinforce the Marines of Fox Company and release the Marines trapped to the north. Lieutenant Colonel Davis.
Some fellow Marines were in trouble. We were going to rescue them, and nothing was going to stand in our way.
The Marines counterattacked and fought their way clear of every ambush and penetration. Every Marine gave his all. Every inch would be a fight for their very existence. Private First Class Win Scott remembers.
There were bodies strapped on the barrels of artillery, on the sides of trucks, across hoods, anywhere there was space. The wounded guy next to me froze to death the second night.
As the column blasted its way mile by mile down the goat path of a road, in the bleak skies overhead, the Marine Air Ground Team revealed its full potential like never before. Diving into the canyons, strafing, bombing, and dropping napalm on any and everything that threatened their fellow Marines on the ground. After 15 days of some of the most brutal conditions in fighting any warriors have ever faced, the Marines, their dead, their wounded, reached Hang Nam and the sea.
Okay, practice makes perfect, right? All right. Get the light there for me. Dale, like to come forward? Get you this. Gosh, how do I get into this? You need a safety belt, right? All right. Good morning to all of you. Morning. Can I just take this thing like this?
There you go.
Take charge. After seeing the film, I'm a little emotional. My experience with the Corps started right here at Olathe Naval Air Station. I was due sea duty, and I was stationed here as a dental technician. I was making false teeth over here. And I got my orders to go to San Francisco to board an aircraft carrier or a cruiser. And I got to my reporting station, and the guy said, "I'm sorry, buddy, your boat is already gone. You need to report to the Fleet Marine Force, Camp Pendleton." Well, I had not had much experience in Marine Corps tactics or Marine Corps spirit, discipline, and all of those things. But I sure learned fast. We went to San Diego, to the Marine Corps depot there, and then on out to Camp Pendleton. And Camp Pendleton was a real experience for me. I had not experienced anything like that before, and I had a master sergeant, a gunny sergeant, that shaped me up pretty quick. We got on the Oglethorpe and headed for Japan in August, and arrived in Japan in Kyoto, and just in time for they call them, I think, cyclones over there. And so we rode out a cyclone, and we were whisked away at night with on trains with blinds drawn, and no one, we were not permitted to open the blinds at all. And we ended up at a small station in central Japan. And I was assigned then to the 1st Medical Battalion. After we received some additional training and some idea of the mission, And I think most of you here realize that the Corps stresses mission. You complete the mission. And we then boarded the troop ships. No, we boarded LSTs, and started for Korea. They had already landed. Korea is a peninsula, and this is Busan. And the North Koreans had advanced clear down to a perimeter around Busan. And there was a Marine brigade that went in there, and some army from Japan, but they were poorly trained and had a lot of difficulty holding the line there. So our illustrious leader, General MacArthur, had the idea of landing here at Incheon, and this was the second most important battle of the Korean War. It only took maybe a day to accomplish. Wabido Island, which is over here, took about 45 minutes. Now, Wabido Island, its importance was it was a small island out in the bay of Incheon, and Incheon, the tides at Incheon were terrific. As a matter of fact, they rotated drastically. If you got caught there in 8 hours, you were stuck. So we had not very much time to get supplies into Incheon. And this island afforded us some help with the supply. It was connected to the mainland with a causeway. So the causeway was really important. And so the causeway was the first to get hit, and there was no resistance. There was very little resistance on the causeway at all, and the island. As a matter of fact, we took it in about 45 minutes to an hour. It wasn't very long, and there were very few casualties there. And then we moved into Incheon, and Incheon took a little while, but nothing really significant. And we moved on then to Seoul. Seoul is the X here. Now, in the history books, you're not going to read about the crossing of the Han River. The Han River is about a quarter of a mile wide, and the beach is equally as wide. And at that time, it had nothing on it. It was bare. And Sigmund Rhee insisted that the Korean Marines or Army or whatever they were called take Seoul. And as a result, they failed. Their attempt to cross the Han, they tried it twice and didn't make it. So they brought the landing craft from Incheon to the Han River, and we made it across the Han River, but it was not without a lot of difficulty. The fire was really intense, and if you want to call it a firefight, I'd call it more than that. And that was my first real exposure to combat. And I learned a lot in those few days there. And we were then in Seoul about, I want to say 3 or 4 days. And we were moved to the hills around Seoul to protect it. And then back to Incheon. And we were then boarded again on the LSTs, and those things are flat bottomed, you know, and you ride on those things and they hit the water and they jar you, and you don't sleep or rest well. And well, anyway, it was not a joyful ride. And over here is Wonsan, and the harbor had been mined. The Chinese and the North Koreans mined the harbor clear out a few miles out into the ocean, and all of the mines had to be removed before the troops could go make their landing. In the meantime, the Army and the Korean Army made it to Wonsan before we did. And when we landed on the beach, Bob Hope met us. And that was a great greeting if you ever wanted. And of course, we were really relieved about that. We then, as Marines are properly, they're resourceful people, we'll put it that way. And they stole a rail locomotive and some rail cars. And so we put straw in the rail cars instead of riding those trucks all the way from here, from Wonsan to Hungnam in an open truck. We took a luxury ride on straw and freight cars. But one of the interesting things that happened along the way was when we stopped, we had to stop quite frequently because these little locomotives had to have water. So we'd stop in a village and get water, and the local people would come out and give us fresh fruit, which was really appreciated because we'd been eating out of cans for some time. And later that proved to be a privilege. But we got to Hung Nam, and again, our illustrious leader, Mr. MacArthur, General MacArthur, and you can tell that I'm not a fan of that guy. I don't think you'll find a GI on the ground that has any admiration for him. He ordered us north to the Yellow River. All right, to get to the Yellow River, which is up here. This is Manchuria. Right in here is the reservoir, and Manchuria is right along here. And we had to make it up there by, there was rail cars that went up so far, and then it was by truck the rest of the way, and then by foot. All the wounded at that time were ferried back to Hung Nam by ambulance, and there was always a guy riding with the ambulance driver, and they called it shotgun. And ambulances would come back with holes and damaged, and you can't imagine what they looked like. And the wounded came back that way for some time until they closed the loop. And what I mean by that is the encirclement by the Chinese. We gradually moved up this single lane road that you could only get a truck, one truck wide at a time. So you can understand the logistic problems. So you can put that down now. I don't think we need it. You can understand the logistic problems that we had in terms of supply with the road was the only supply that we had, and also parachute drops. And at first the parachute drops were not very effective because they would drift into enemy hands, and we would lose them. But as time went on, why, they got better at it. And maybe this is a good place to talk a little bit about the Corsairs and how important they were to us. And some little facts that maybe you're not aware of. We were operating so closely with the Marine pilots that we wore panels, different colored panels on different days, so that they could visually see us on the ground and not drop napalm or whatever on us. And the pilots that flew those things were just amazing. Some of the valleys that they went into is just amazing. We were at about 6,000, Richard, about 6,000 feet altitude.
About, yeah. I don't think it was quite that high, but
Four?
the top of the peaks were.
Yeah, top of the peaks were about 6. And the wind was blowing constantly. And the snow was, well, very significant. At night, you didn't sleep because nighttime was the bad time when you'd hear the drums and the bugles and the chime and the gongs and all kinds of stuff, and then you'd hear the screaming and the Chinese would pop out of the snow all over like popcorn. And it's pretty tough to deal with because you couldn't sleep during the day. It was cold, and everybody, you couldn't build a fire either. So we had to lick the contents of the ration cans. And of course, that led to diarrhea. Now, personally, I had 3 pair of pants on. And I had strings on 2 of the flies, and the third one was open. And I couldn't grab them with mitten. Without that string, I couldn't have grabbed the fly with my mittens. And as it said in the video, we carried our morphine and medications. We, of course, didn't have time to do a lot of medicating or serious stuff in the field because we were just overcome. And so it was a matter of tourniquets and morphine. And then doing triage right on the spot. And for a 19-year-old kid to be doing triage is a heavy responsibility as I look back on it now. The walkout. Am I running over? What time is it? What time? Am I talking too long here?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes more?
Okay.
The walkout was not very pleasant, to say the least. We were on rotation, and what I mean by that is we would rotate taking the high peaks to protect the road, and so we'd spend X number of hours on the peaks, and then we'd be on the road walking. and anybody that could walk, walked. And the automobiles or the trucks and ambulances and whatever had wheels was moving and carrying the dead and wounded. And I'm sorry to say that, you know, the Marine Corps prides themselves on not leaving anyone behind, but I'm sorry to say that we have several along the way that didn't make it. They were buried there, which was difficult to take. I often think about, well, how in the hell did we make it? And the answer that I have is that it was the spirit of the Corps and the discipline and the commingling of units. There was the 5th Marines and the 7th Marines and headquarters battalion that I became affiliated with. And they all intermingled for one purpose. And that was to get the hell out of there. Because we were outnumbered 60-1. I think that I'll close by making a comment about leaving. We all, not all, of course, but the troops that I was with formed up just before we were to go to the troop ships. And if you can imagine people who had slept for days, who had parachutes wrapped around their heads with the hoods of their parkas over that, and eyes that were just sunken. I'm trying to describe this to you so you have some visual understanding of what it was like. We were supposed to change socks every 8 hours, 6 hours, whatever the hell it was, so you wouldn't get frostbite. But how do you do that? Do you just park yourself down along the side of the road and decide to change your shoes or your boots? I don't think so. So we joined up, we got all squared away the best we could get squared away, and started our final walk, march, whatever you want to call it, to the ships. And we sang the Marine Corps hymn. I get real emotional about that, because I find that I'm more Marine than a Marine. I owe my life to them. And the reservoir, I don't think, Richard, there are very many around anymore. I know Richard and I are the only ones that I know of in this area. And they blew the place up. They wired it all, and I don't know what kind of stuff they used, but boy, they sure blew the hell out of it, and there wasn't anything left when we left. They burned our clothes. Of course, we had lice. We had, you know. Can you imagine clothes that you hadn't had a bath or a shower in a month? What it kind of smelled like, you know?
Pretty right.
And so they burned all of that stuff. Well, that's about all I can. Oh, I want to go back, and Richard, I hope you'll help me here.
1 second. Richard, would you mind standing? Face these guys. Richard and I, and I'm repeating myself, we've been longtime members in the Midwest MGA Club. This morning I'm having breakfast with our club members, and Richard's across, and he's a 27-year veteran of the Marine Corps. So I asked him across the table, I said, Richard, did you ever serve in Korea? Oh yeah, he says, I did. I said, how about Chosin? Oh yeah. And so I invited him to come down. These two guys never have, I think, have never met each other. First time they met each other right here. And for a good half hour back there on the couch, they reminisced about their service. Richard was in the artillery.
Reconnaissance.
And with the 1st Marines?
Yeah, the 10th Marines.
10th Marines.
But I was an artillery observer with the infantry in Korea. The last 3 months over there, I had moved back in seniority and became a battery commander. But before that, I had 6 months straight just with the infantry. Close to where he was, but we were in different regiments and in different battles, so except for the route back.
Right. Everybody was one on the route back.
How far, just out of curiosity, how far that 65 miles did you hoof it?
Probably 20 or so.
Okay, guys.
And it was quite a walk, because on the other side of the valley, 1,000 yards away, the Chinese were there. And so we had to walk, and they kept firing at us. And in the beginning, everybody would drop down when a round hit. But after a while, we got tired of getting up and down. Everybody just kept on walking. So
Yeah, it was like fleas, you know.
it was too far to take a good rifle shot at somebody. It was, all you're doing is harassing. So we walked and rode an open train the rest of the way. After spending a night on the ground.
One of the things that I want Richard to help me with here is remembering. Here, we'll share this.
Okay.
We reached a place where there was a dam that had been damaged or blown up, and it was a hydroelectric dam, and we had to cross over that on the top of it to get out. And there wasn't any other way to do it but to build another bridge. So they dropped one, and they damaged some of the structures, and they decided that was foolish to drop bridges out of airplanes and have them hit that hard ground and be bent. So they dropped 3 bridges, and the engineers put the bridges together with the 3 bridges. Am I right?
Right.
Richard?
I think they had one left over. But
Yeah. And then the other feat that is miraculous that we talked about is the building of the airfield at Hagaroo. That saved the Corps. They brought C-47s in and out of there after it was built, and the engineers worked day and night to get that done, and it was like breaking granite. The ground was so hard. So they finally got the airfield built, and we started evacuating wounded and bringing in replacements and supply. Do you remember that, Richard?
I was at one post, the southern one, place called Coterie, and see, these were several different big encampments where we went in the perimeters to protect ourselves from the Chinese. And interestingly enough, my forwarder's over post was on the end of the runway because the hills were Chinese and the valleys we were located in, because this old railroad track that he mentioned here ran right around, and actually my observation post was on that railroad track at the end of the runway. And the engineers and the pilots that flew had the highest admiration for them, because they had to drop down a hill and then flatten out and then set the plane down and then load it on. And not all were successful. The first helicopters were brought in, and they decided to try to medevac some people, and they put them on the outside carriers of the helicopter, and when they got to the hospital, they were frozen stiff, so they didn't try that anymore.
Gentlemen, we thank you for your service. Before you leave here,
Dale, we thank you for your service, as Ron said, and we want to give you a little token of our appreciation and do it in the traditional way. We have for you a Heart of America CAF challenge coin, and we give these to people who have demonstrated service to the country and also service to our wing, and we would like to give you both a challenge coin for that, and do, as I say, do it in the usual manner. So I'll have to put this down. Dale, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. This one's not open. Oh. There we go. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
they're going to